Right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Centre for Languages, Culture and Communication here at Imperial College. This is our wonderful research seminar series coordinated by myself and Dr. Michael Paraskos, who's here today. We're delighted to welcome and indeed welcome back Dr. Anna Nyburg, who's delivering today's seminar. So to give some of you will know her, some of us have known her for quite a long time. So Anna used to teach German and Italian here at the CLCC and Imperial, and was indeed the evening class coordinator, a very important role. She now is at the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies at the University of London, where she obtained her PhD in 2009, if I can read your handwriting correctly. Yeah. She's written wonderful books, sometimes launched here at the Centre, on refugees from Nazism in Great Britain, on publishing, textiles, graphic design, and of course, today's talk. She's also co-produced a wonderful film with Dr. Robert Sternberg of this department called Refugee Britain, Stories of Refugee Designers, which was finished in 2017, and we're all looking forward to seeing it. Anna, pleasure to see you again. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. I would like to say that I didn't put the words wonderful in front of that's Michael's own addition. I didn't say they were wonderful books. Hope some of them might be. Okay, today I'm going to talk to you about this book. Ooh, just about lifted, over a kilogram. So what happened was in 2023, I was invited to the offices of Thames and Hudson. You might know their logo. And they asked me to write a historical part of this large book that's not even published yet. That's an advanced copy coming out in March, which is to celebrate their 75 years of trading. They were founded in 1949. And they said that I would have to interview people, staff, editors, and so on, past and present, for the copy for the book. That's what happened. The reason they chose me is that I'd done my PhD with Professor Charmian Brinson, who instigated this series of research seminars. And I'd done it on the creation of two publishing houses, art publishing houses, Thames and Hudson and Weiden, and they were both founded by Viennese emigres. So very niche subject and exactly right for what they wanted, of course, at Thames and Hudson. So I started off, I sent some sample texts in, and they said, yes, okay, but what they really wanted was not so much about the staff, particularly Anna, not so much about the refugee staff, but far more about the books and the authors. So I have to say I've slightly tailored today's talk more to my own interests, and I focus a little bit more on the early days as well. So the first person we come to is the founder. His name is Walter Neurath, and you can see him in the top left-hand corner, sketched by his personal friend, Oskar Kokoschka. And underneath is a sketch of his son, Thomas, by the same artist. Now, in fact, Thames and Hudson was founded by two people, by Walter Neurath and his later wife. She was from Germany, she was from Berlin, Eva Feuchtwanger. But the reason I'm not concentrating on her is not because she's a woman, but because Thames and Hudson have already written a book about her. There's a monograph out. And also, Walter was very much the publisher and the businessman, and he would have brought that to Thames and Hudson, whereas Eva really brought a lot more in terms of art and design. So the story starts just a bit. Yes, well, just a brief word about Walter. So he was born in 1903 into an assimilated Jewish family. But the important thing is that that is right in the context of Red Vienna. By the time he was grown up, Red Vienna started, it was a left-wing regime, really after the First World War, I think officially 1920, but I think it actually started then. And it came to a very sudden end in 1934, where it was destroyed by Austro-fascists. But as long as it lasted, it was the most fantastic time, incredibly progressive. There were all sorts of wonderful social housing projects, some of it you can still see today. There was free education, art education, including for children, lots of things for children. gyms, theatres, concerts, and so on. Sociology, psychology flourished. And there was also a new social and sexual freedom as well, much like London in the swinging 60s. And Walter Neurath, who would have been just the right age then, sort of a young man at that time, he embraced the new age with enthusiasm. He was certainly left-wing. He was a strong social democrat, not a communist ever. He lived, of course, in a commune with 3 men and 3 women. One of the men was Bruno Bettelheim, the psychoanalyst. And eventually they drew lots to each marry a woman, a random woman, just to pacify the neighbors who were a bit conservative. But he was very much a product of Red Vienna. Throughout his life, he'd be driven by an urge to educate people, young people in particular, or people without a university education, and to show them the world, to show the world of culture, particularly emphasis on that word show through images. He enrolled at the University of Vienna in the Faculty of Philosophy, but he also, as you could do at European universities, he went to study other subjects as well, including art history and archaeology. Now, he's written, he wrote at that time a CV. There's a little bit of it here. I think it really sums up Walter Neurath so well. At that same time, as he was a student, I took up lecturing in history of art at institutions similar to the Workers' Education Association in this country. I took part in the organization of art exhibitions. 1925 went to Paris to organize a successful exhibition of French 19th century paintings in Vienna. In 1924, I started studying book production and typography and designed for the Viennese exhibition of 1924 the catalogue, which was considered to be an outstanding example of modern typography. At the university, I was a founding and active member of the anti-Nazi students' organization. And there's Eva Neurath with her friend Oskar Kokoschka. On the right-hand side, you can see spreads of the catalogue that he talked about. He was very, very interested in book design. And in fact, the 1920s was a time of a real flowering of book arts on the continent, particularly in Germany and Austria. And yeah, to bear in mind, this is 100 years old now, but it's still pretty modern, doesn't it? You get a lot of sans serif typefaces and asymmetrical page design and things like that. So book design would be a continuing passion for Walter Neurath. So when he was a student, unfortunately, he had to interrupt his studies and work for the family business because his father fell ill. They had a tea and coffee importing business. But of course, being Walter Neurath, he just took everything he could from that experience. He learned about how to run a business, about marketing and things like that, things which would stand him in very good stead when he had his own company. After that, when his father was better, he went to work for, I think, about 4 different publishing companies. One produced educational books with a clearly anti-Nazi bias, and of course was closed down in 1938 when Austria was annexed into the Third Reich. At one, he produced a series for children called Wissenschaft für Kinder. You can translate Wissenschaft either as knowledge or science. And it was published simultaneously in 7 languages. That's co-editions, again, the shades of things to come for Thames and Hudson. At that company, by the way, he met the art historian E.H. Gombrich, who's later to become famous as the author of Story of Art, published by Phaidon and still in print today. But it was Walter Neurath who published Gombrich's first book, which is called A Little History of the World for young people. It was only translated into English in 2005. And Gombrich remained a very good friend of the Neuraths, writing the introduction to at least one of their books. Contacts made in those short years before emigration were to prove very important for his later career. He was an excellent networker, very, very outgoing, a really larger-than-life character, very sociable. By 1938, he was at a publishing house called the Frick Verlag, but he knew his days were numbered, of course, in Austria as a Jewish man. Right up to the end, he produced books such as a series teaching children French, German, and English through 1,000 images, presumably with no text. That's just how it worked. And he sold, the first 2 titles sold out completely in just 6 weeks. So he knew what sold. Pictures, education, young people. So these are sort of themes from Red Vienna, and these are the kind of leitmotifs that you see throughout his life. Then the inevitable happened. In 1938, he was served this letter. It doesn't have any Nazi regalia on because it was from the publishing company, but basically it said, you are not fulfilling the Aryan criteria for your job, so you're dismissed, essentially. Interestingly, this letter is not in the book. It's still owned by the family. I was amazed that they had managed to keep it, and I wanted it to be in the book, but I didn't win. By then, Walter Neurath had married a second wife, not by lot, like the first time. His wife, Mariana, who was expecting their first child, who would be Constance, their daughter. He had to flee to England, where he already had very, very good contacts. There's a story that goes that when they had to move, they had the removal men at the back of the flat. And at the front of the flat, Walter's mother chatted pleasantly to the Gestapo, while at the back, they were very quickly and unobtrusively moving out all their priceless pictures. They had paintings by Kokoschka, by Egon Schiele, Gustav Klimt, and lots of furniture and china, all of which they managed to get to Britain, which is not the usual story. And the family that they went to live with in Britain were the Margisons, Viscount and Lady Margison. They were very well connected. And they lived there with this family for 5 years. Their daughter Constance was born in 1938 and their son Thomas in 1940. So what did Neurath do for a job? Well, he was, as I said, a fantastic networker. Very quickly, he got a job with a company called Adprint, being a composite of advertising and printing. Now, I'd never heard of this company before I started my research, and now I'm always amazed that it's not better known. It was founded by a fellow Viennese Jewish emigre called Wolfgang Voges, who was very much like Neurath in lots of ways. He'd founded Adprint just as a kind of printing job, essentially looking for printing work. He'd travel around Europe and then have it all printed up in Czechoslovakia, where they had the state-of-the-art printing. But in England, Voges took on Neurath as his production manager, and they decided that they would do book packaging. Now, I don't know if you know what book packaging is. Essentially, you think up an idea for a book, then you source an author, then you arrange for the design and the printing, you print up the whole thing, and then you sell it to a publisher for sales and distribution. This worked particularly well during the war. And don't forget, they fled in 38, the war starts in 39, so almost as soon as they're there. In the wartime, there was a shortage of paper, and publishing houses got an allocation. The allocation was based on how much you had used just before the war. So one who struck lucky was Collins, still going today, because they'd had a very good few years just before the war, and so they had lots of paper. And Adprint then published or produced a lot of these packaged books for them. Now, you might have heard of a series called The New Naturalist. Don't know, does that ring a bell? Here is one book that Walter produced in 1943. Lovely book. Look who it's by, J.B. Priestley, big name, and wonderful colour photography. It was all printed in Scotland. It was harder then, of wartime, you know, you couldn't print abroad. So it was printed locally, and that was Walter's job. And interestingly, a little Viennese touch the end papers, yes, the papers between the covers and the text, feature these, not a very good photograph. You may know what these are, anybody? What are they?
I remember your talk.
Isotypes. They're called isotypes. They were designed and invented by yet another Viennese emigre whose name was Otto Neurath. We had a symposium here in the center. Such an interesting person, so many different aspects, graphic design, philosophy, and I can't remember the other. Anyway, so each little figure represents so many thousand people. It was supposed to be, it's still used now. And it came out of Red Vienna, this system. So it's a little bit of his home knowledge there. Okay, so the most famous series of books that Adprint produced for Collins were these things called Britain in Pictures. And you can see some of them on the right-hand side there. They produced about 163 of them altogether. And you can see the titles there, things like English country houses, Birds of Britain. You can hopefully read the titles. And they had 3 or 4 very important features which would be taken up by Neurath and used for his own company, Thames and Hudson, when he founded that after the war. The first one is that the authors were all very respected and they were experts in their field. So we got John Betjeman, Peter Sackville-West, Graham Greene, and Chiquetta Hawkes, an archaeologist, very important archaeologist, happened to be married to J.B. Priestley, actually, and she later became a series editor at Thames and Hudson. So that was one, experts, written by experts. The design, well, it may not look very funky and modern now, but that was very modern for the 1940s. And they had another feature, something which was very dear to Walter Neurath's heart. He believed that if you had text and an image at the same time, that you had a completely different reading experience. Because most of the books in those days were written with text, and then the pictures would all be grouped together in the middle on different paper, or perhaps at the end. But he thought wherever possible that you should integrate the text and the image. So there were about 3 million sold. They started at the beginning of the war and they ran on into the 50s, so let's talk about 3 million. And the idea of them, in a way, was to remind the Brits what they were fighting for, and also remind people in the Dominions as well. You know, these were important things that were important, and you should fight to protect them. And that had consequences for the political status of the books. Another important feature, apart from the design, the authors, was the staff. Now, this is where the refugees come in. There was a disproportionately high number of refugees from Nazism there. They were from Germany, Austria, other countries occupied by the Nazis. Just one was a lady called Ruth Rosenberg. I was too late to interview her. She just died in her 90s. She was a picture researcher. Now, picture researchers didn't exist in Britain in the 40s. It hadn't been invented. But she came from a huge mega publishing company in Berlin called Ullstein, and they had their own picture archive. Picture researchers then would choose the right image for whichever journal, newspaper, or book they were producing. So she came with not just those skills, but she actually brought a picture archive with her, which was used at Adprint. She went on later to work for Thames and Hudson. In 1940, you probably know, we had the internment crisis. There were 80,000 refugees, mostly German and Austrian, and among them, perhaps there were fifth columnists. Who knew? I mean, we'd had the fall of France, the Netherlands, Norway. Perhaps some of these people were pro-Nazi and were helping Germans to plan their occupation of Britain. So there was a panic action, and many thousands of refugees were interned, mostly on the Isle of Man. Now, Walter Neurath got up very lightly. He was only interned for 2 weeks because of the propaganda importance of the Britain in Pictures series that was happening. But while he was there, he was approached by another Viennese man, another Jewish Viennese refugee called Wilhelm Feuchtwang, who asked Walter to go and visit his wife Eva, who was there in Britain now with their baby son Stefan. And she didn't have any form of income. You know, the husband was interned and there was no proper benefit system in those days. There was no safety net. So he was a bit desperate. So Walter went off, met Eva. Eva had an interesting life working for auction houses and various things in Berlin, but not much formal education. Anyway, he offered her a job at Adprint. And she threw herself into learning English and working there. And at Reading University, they have a publisher's archive, and you can read all the correspondence from her and people like Otto Neurath with his isotypes, you know, arranging for them to use them for Adprint books and so on. So all was going very well. Adprint was doing fantastically, but there's a problem. You've got Wolfgang Voges, big, bossy, opinionated, creative, and Walter Neurath, ditto. So inevitably a clash. Walter Neurath wanted to run things himself. So with Eva Neurath in 1949, after the war now, they decided together, they took all the information they could, they experienced from Adprint, and they decided they would set up a publishing company which would concentrate very much on illustrated and art books. And they would call it not Feuchtwang and Neurath, which wouldn't go down terribly well in London, but instead to name it after the two rivers of London and New York, where they had very close links with museums and other publishers with whom they planned to make distribution contacts. But in fact, the Neuraths told me we could have used almost any rivers, the Seine and the whatever, Spree, Danube, because they were always an international publisher. They chose as they're called colophon, the little icon for the publisher. You can see them on the back here. A dolphin, which is supposed to be a symbol of friendship. So you have one facing east and one facing west. And here at the bottom, you can see some of the other iterations of dolphins designed by different people over the decades. Walter Neurath, a quote from him, quote, "I found the market for art books in England to be non-existent, so we had to create art books in disguise," unquote. Initially, all sorts of books were published, even a novel, but otherwise their books were and always would be illustrated. The very first Thames and Hudson title came about thanks to Eva's initiative. So I mentioned the publisher Collins, who published most of the Adprint books. She was there one day working, and she saw these great piles of proofs, I suppose galley proofs, with photographs for what would be this book, English Cathedrals. With photographs by this Swiss photographer, Martin Hüllemann. They're lovely, have a look after if you like. In those days, they used something called photogravure, which makes it lovely and deep, lovely, deep, creamy shadows as well. And it was a kind of gamble, really. He bought 13,000 copies of the photographs of the illustrations, having pre-sold, without it existing, 10,000 copies of the book to American publishers. And it was a good gamble, it paid off. It was still in print in 1971. I think it sold about 20,000 copies in all. And Martin Hüllemann would go on to produce lots and lots of other photographic books. Reviews of early titles at Thames and Hudson included phrases like jargon-free for the average reader, appealing to non-specialists. These were qualities which became their USP. Yeah, they were always respected, you know, they're scholarly but accessible. In 1959, 6 of Thames and Hudson's books were chosen as being among the best designed books in Britain by the National Book League, and they were exhibited in the Festival Hall. In 1951, Walter Neurath's wife, Marianne, died, and in 1953, he and Eva got married. It would be a third marriage for both of them. In the new book, there's a long section on how the new company made use of the contacts made pre-war. Too long to go through them all. I'll just tell you about one, a man called Praeger, I would say in English, Praeger in German. He'd emigrated to America, he'd come from Vienna, and his job was to identify European publishers who had not given in to the Nazis. They were uncontaminated. They had defied the way they were supposed to publish. And one such person was a French publisher called Fernand Azan, and a collaboration with him resulted in a small black hardback called Picasso, a study of his work by Frank Elgar and Robert Maillard. They managed to sell 12,500 copies just in 14 months. And this inspired Walter and Eva. Walter loved a series. He really liked a series. He said, let's have a series and we'll call it World of Art, World of Art. Walter said, it's the right format, the right vehicle, and the right price. They were very cheap, even though they were initially hardbacks. And they were written again by the best scholars, but they were always very accessible and became very, very popular with art students and gallery visitors. I think they were pretty much the first books in the market like that. You know, they weren't heavy, great big folio books, but something you could put in your pocket. Okay, inevitably, I'd like to look at 3 people who were refugees, but big contributors to Thames and Hudson's success. They were all refugees or survivors. The first is a man called Werner Gutmann, who I did meet, and these are the early World of Art titles, but there are very, very many of them. They're still going today, adding to the series, and but they have just very recently changed the design, so they don't always have this black background. You often see them in bookshops and spinners separately. There's Werner Gutmann. He was born in 1924 into a Jewish family in Berlin, and his father came with him to England in 1936, where Werner's uncle had bought a small defunct publishing company called Hammond and Hammond, which he was running. The mother stayed behind and was killed in the Holocaust. When Werner was grown up, he started to work for Hammond and Hammond, but one day he went to the Festival Hall and saw some beautifully designed books by Thames and Hudson, and he applied for a job there and got it. He became the production manager, hugely important job, overseeing co-editions in the age of hot metal printing. So he didn't bring any German publishing experience. He was only a kid when he came, but he did bring fluency in at least 3 other languages. So, for example, in those days, Thames and Hudson were printing in Switzerland, and Werner spoke fluent German, obviously, and also French, and he later learned Russian and used to go and promote books in the Soviet Union and so on. He also had a very good relationship with Eva Neurath, who was from Berlin, and apparently in those days, you would often hear the hum of German being spoken in the offices, as well as other languages. So I should point out that Walter Neurath didn't take on refugees just out of sympathy. It was a business. He was running a business. He took on people he knew would be good. But of course, having a common background was something that they could share. I've mentioned Ruth Rosenberg. She came from Outprint to Thames and Hudson. Just one little story I was told by Walter Neurath's daughter is that Ruth Rosenberg had no family. It all wiped out. And she had to design a book on the painter Frank Auerbach. Now, Auerbach came on the Kindertransport, and he had no family either. And Ruth Rosenberg became a sort of mother figure to him, but they had a close relationship. And yes, Ruth Rosenberg was a fantastic book designer, and she won many medals and prizes for her book design. Then we have somebody called Shalom Schotten. You can see him in the bottom left-hand corner here with the beard. Try not to look at David Hockney and other people in the photographs. They were friends of the family as well. For Hockney was definitely a friend of the family. Shalom Schotten became the Thames and Hudson's greatest cover designer. He worked very closely with artists when they were producing monographs. I think I'll skip over. Yeah, I'll just say that he survived. He was born in Austria into an Orthodox family, was hidden by a non-Jewish woman with her children. He lived in Czechoslovakia and France, emigrated to Israel after the war, found work as a sign writer for a man called Mr. Grundmann. I'd love to know more about him. Apparently he'd worked at the Festival of Britain in graphic design. And Grundmann told Schotten all about European graphic design. So inspired him, Schotten, to go to the London College of Printing. And there he met somebody called George Adams. But he was actually born Georg Telscher. Yes, yet another Viennese refugee, but one who'd studied at the world-famous Bauhaus. And at that time, George Adams was head of design and art at Thames and Hudson. He introduced Schotten, who gradually took over Adams's job. Adams was going off to work in Africa. And Schotten worked, I think it's true to say, when I met him, he was in his late 80s and still working at Thames and Hudson. This is very Thames and Hudson. People worked into their 80s and sometimes 90s, including Eva Neurath, and not just the refugees, but other people as well. And they all told me that they had a terrible work-life balance, that they just worked all the time. They couldn't help themselves. So very interesting. Yes, I'll just show you one of Schotten's covers. You may know that book. So because Schotten spent a lot of time hanging out with Hockney and talking to him, and we discovered that that Hockney was very interested in the idea of reflections. So he's playing here with a reflection. He's got the wrong reflection, hasn't he, in the mirror? And then you've also got the reflection of the title as well. So it's just a little nod to some of Hockney's interests, which I think is good. Schotten designed hundreds and hundreds of Thames and Hudson's covers, also winning prizes. So what kind of books? Archaeology. Archaeology was very important. We know Neurath studied that, and his son Thomas studied archaeology at Cambridge as well. The catalogue for 1957 announced a new archaeology series called Ancient Peoples and Places, designed by George Adams of the Bauhaus. There they are, just some of the covers on the right. And the series editor was somebody called Glyn Daniel. And you can see him on the right-hand corner of that photograph. So that's Glyn Daniel, and that's Walter Neurath there. And Glyn Daniel had been Thomas's tutor at Cambridge, but also, I love this bit, he was apparently a television personality and wrote crime fiction books. That makes him the perfect Thames and Hudson author, really. You've got the sort of scholarly side and then the accessible popular touch as well. So the first decade of trading is nearly over, but I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but before the digital age, there was so many problems and challenges in producing a physical book. For example, they were doing a book of the collection in the Prado in Madrid, and the photographer found to his horror that every time somebody used the lift, that the lights started to flicker. It was using the electricity. So all the photographs were rubbish. They couldn't use them. They sent off for new photographic film. It was impounded by customs for ages, and then it all warped in the heat of Madrid. So just one thing. Books stored in their New York warehouse, all buckled in the humidity, and all had to be rebound, every one of them. Just endless problems. As if that wasn't hard enough, co-editions. Co-editions were Thames and Hudson's great strength, and they had a great rivalry with the other art publishing house, Phaidon. They both said that they'd invented it, but that's for another time. So I don't know if you know about co-editions. essentially, you put the drop the illustration into a blank page, and then you leave space around for the text to be inserted in different languages. Of course, different languages take up different amounts of space. So it's always a nightmare for the designer to fit the text without, too much blank or just too tight and so on. But of course, it makes sense. If you've got expensive illustrations, you need as many people on board, as many different international publishers as you can to bring down the unit costs. And yes, we'll come to one example in a minute. Also, printing, especially the new color printing, was very important to the success of illustrated books. Now, Eva Neurath had a gift for being able to detect nuances of color differences between the originals and the prints. But it was a sort of curse in a way. For one book called The National Gallery, which was, a book of the collection, she was so frustrated with the reproductions, which weren't true to her, that she called the head of the printing company up from the West Country, and she said, come to the National Gallery. And they sat down in front of Rembrandt's A Woman Taken in Adultery, and then they had the proofs in front of them. And she said, now can you see the difference? And he couldn't, but she could. Yes. So anyway, eventually, longer after the war, they managed to change printers. I'm afraid the European printers were much, much better, and the Eastern, they printed in Japan for a time as well, and they unfortunately were much, much better. Thames and Hudson invited readers to experience a museum without walls, discover works of art without having to go to a city or a different country even. That was still a relatively new experience for most people in those days. The company headed into their second decade of trading with 48 new titles on Jackson Pollock, 4 new World of Art titles, many more volumes of Ancient People and Places, and so on. A new series started, The Arts of Mankind, with Andre Malraux as the series editor. In 1961, the son, Thomas, joined Thames and Hudson. He was only 21, working with Werner Gutmann. In those days, the company was housed in Bloomsbury Street in several houses, which was a nightmare. It meant that you had to go down. You couldn't go along. You had to go outside and rush upstairs, like a rabbit warren it was, apparently. Werner Gutmann thought that he'd been taken on mainly to oversee a series called The Great Civilizations. Here are some spreads from that. So this just, again, gives you an idea of the scale of things. So each volume was to have 1,000 illustrations. It was written by 15 eminent archaeologists, and co-editions were produced simultaneously in French, German, Italian, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish. The first printing was 200,000 copies, and the printing blocks for the photographs were made in 3 other countries. You can imagine sending the proofs to all of these authors and back. It must have been a nightmare. I think of Werner Gutmann like a conductor of a very vast, unruly orchestra, because the timing was so crucial. I mean, that was how it was done. Somehow they managed it. Things were looking very good for Thames and Hudson at the end of the 60s, until the unexpected and tragic happened. In 1967, Walter Neurath died of cancer, aged only 63. He'd made arrangements for the continuous running of the company very quietly and calmly before his death. Thomas Neurath, aged only 27, who had not planned to be in publishing, had to take over the company. He was supported, though, by these 2 women, Eva Neurath here on the left, and his sister Constance there. She, meanwhile, had become the art director at Thames and Hudson. And Eva was apparently wonderful and supported him absolutely with everything he needed. Constance was particularly good. She was very different in personality. I'm still around, I know Constance well, and she was very sociable and good at networking, whereas Thomas was much more reserved. So she was very good at making contacts and so on. She's very good friends with the artist Francis Bacon, who I'm sure was not everybody's best friend. But
unless she's buying the champagne.
yes, possibly. Yes, I'm going to skip over that book about the tapestry. Just talk about Thames and Hudson's strong relationship with museums, museum directors and curators, which played a very large part in their publishing success. They published many books with the V&A, for example. Thomas went above and beyond, of course, his father's own interests. Thomas was very interested in photography as an art form, whereas his father just thought photography was a means to an end. So there was a whole new series of books on photography and design of all kinds, architecture, graphic design, and so on. Children's books, all sorts of things, keeping the program fresh and relevant. In 1999, Eva Neurath died, 50 years after the founding of Thames and Hudson. Yeah, she worked into her 90s there as well, one of the many. 2000, the new millennium began. Terrible challenges for most companies. Brexit, COVID, social media, digital age, all of those things. Not just technical questions, but big questions like, why do people buy physical books? You've got Kindles, you've got iPads, you can source images on the internet. Why do people buy physical books? Luckily, those who are now heading Thames and Hudson rose to the challenge. In 2013, Thomas Neurath stood down after many, many decades as chairman, and Sophie Thompson joined the company. She is now the current CEO, not a Neurath. Both Thomas's daughters, Johanna and Susanna, had joined the company. Susanna didn't stay long, but Johanna became the art director and brought much success in terms of new photography books. She just retired recently. I interviewed Sophie Thompson. She gave me some good quotes. "We don't make books for landfill." I thought that was a good one. Teenage books are always designed with longevity in mind, so they have a long backlist of titles still in print. And on the internet, the point about the internet, Sophie Thompson points out that the teenage books have a curatorial function, which the internet doesn't have. It's just all there, all random. So you still need that guiding hand. Social media, well, that can be used very positively. Here's an example from Teenage. One single tweet from the Smiths guitarist, Johnny Marr, ensured that 500 copies of a special signed edition of the book, Marr's Guitars, sold out in 2 hours. There were several new imprints reflecting new interests, like crowdfunding. They have a small crowdfunding imprint to fund niche titles that otherwise wouldn't be published. There are books about video and computer games, but they still continue to work with major artists, particularly Grayson Perry, who was really brought to the public eye by the senior editor, Jackie Klein. He really wasn't that well known, but they did the first book with him, Thames and Hudson. I stood next to him at a party. Here's a nice example of the enduring commitment to artistic integrity. We've got Paula Rego here. Sorry, Rego, I should say. We have a Portuguese expert in the house, Paula Rego. So for a book called The Complete Graphic Work, they took photographs in the gallery of her work, and it just was not up to scratch. So the Thames and Hudson, what's his title? Production director, Neil Palfreyman, I interviewed him. And Paul Rego had let him take 80 of her paintings in his car and drive them all the way to Germany to the super Uber publisher printer Steidl, who are really, really good. And they scanned the paintings in sections and then reunited them into what you see here to get this fantastic result. I just think it says something about Thames and Hudson that this extremely well-known artist had trusted them with her paintings to make this perfect image. Fashion was always a bit of a poor child in the design world, and Thames and Hudson hadn't had anything to do with it until they had a new member of staff, Adélia Sabatini, who was a French philosophy student, really. And she had the idea of making a book, not the conventional fashion book, but catwalks, just catwalks. And catwalks had always been thought to be an ephemeral thing that you threw away and didn't keep, but she did one for Chanel, and it was phenomenally successful. Oops, there we are. On that slide out in the wrong order. So then she did a whole series of all the major couture houses, including, as you can see here, Vivienne Westwood. So that was a new departure. Here. Design, yes, sorry, apart from the museums, there are other archives to be explored as well. And the art director, the current art director, Tristan Delancey at T&H, had the idea of going to the Wellcome. We know about the Wellcome Trust here. I think it should be that one, yes. And that the result of that was a book that some of you may know, called The Sick Rose, which was based on, yes, sort of archival material in the Wellcome. Sorry, I've got my notes in a twist. So we should be coming to the end now. You'll be pleased to hear. Commissioning editor for art, Roger Thorpe, realized that illustration had been neglected, and he's commissioned a series on contemporary illustrators that's still going now. The company continued to work with museums. Yes, I've talked about that, talked about fashion. Finally, we got to 2024. There was a huge party at the Victoria and Albert Museum just down the road to celebrate 75 years of trading. Very sadly, Thomas Neurath died in July 2025. I'd managed to spend several days interviewing him, so it was very sad when he died. But he was involved in every single stage of production of the book. Indeed, the whole book was really his own initiative, partly a tribute to his father, but really to show everything really that the publishing house had produced in those 75 years. And although he didn't live to see the book out, he died in the knowledge that it would be fantastic, it would be great and beautiful, and that all the content would be as accurate as he had given. In 2025 too, the company moved into new premises. And I'll finish with a quote from the book. I suspect it's from Sophie. And here's a picture of their new premises. It's in King's Cross. It is fitting that the new London headquarters was formerly occupied by the celebrated Gagosian Gallery. The walls echo with the voices of artists and other creative individuals, a constant reminder that at the heart of all of T&H's endeavours is a desire to share the very best of human creativity with the wider world. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. We've got about 10 minutes for questions or comments. Who would like to get us started, please?
When's the book out?
Next month, March the 12th.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Thank you. Coming out about 2 weeks. Any further points?
Anybody want to look at it? Do have a look. It's quite splendid. It's very heavy. Lovely colour. Very beautiful.
Do you know what's happened to dolphins on the front doorsteps? Where they've gone to? Because I noticed they're no longer there.
Oh, they are. They're always there.
No, but the
No, the
actual
doorstep.
physicals.
Oh,
No,
the
but the actual
doorstep.
physical
Oh,
ones,
yes.
Yes. Do you
I
know where they've
don't
gone
know.
to?
No, you're quite right that where they used to work, they
Yeah,
had the
yeah.
dolphins in the mosaics, didn't
Yeah,
they? Did you,
yeah.
did
I
you
used
work
to work
there?
there, yeah.
Did you?
Yeah,
You worked at T&H?
Yes.
Oh,
yeah,
right.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Right.
Yes, I was only in those offices. I did. I left just before they moved to Holborn. Yeah.
Oh,
I was a
right.
picture researcher. Yeah.
Because that's a photograph of it, isn't it? The
Yes,
mosaic,
yes,
the slide I
yes.
showed you is
And I
actually
just-
the
yeah.
mosaic.
And I noticed only the other day I was going around to my daughter's publisher around the corner, and I just thought, oh, I'll go and look at the dolphins. They weren't there, and well, perhaps it's not a
I
shame.
heard people talking about it, but I never found out what had happened to them.
Yes,
they were
I'm sure
there.
there's yes. And actually, I mean, maybe there's just some wonderful archive, because I used to work in the picture archive, and that's been, I think, probably because it's all been digitalised, it would have gone to the country, I should imagine.
Okay.
Somewhere, don't know, to an archive.
Yeah. They always thought they didn't have an archive, but they did use a lot of physical archive for this book.
Oh, there
I
was
saw
a
a great
fabulous
big,
archive.
yes.
Because
yeah.
the original, we had a lot of the original beautiful Martin Hilleman photos, black and white photos, gorgeous, you know,
Yeah.
really, they were like
Oh,
works
how
of art themselves.
interesting.
Yeah,
Oh, I wish
yeah.
I'd met you
Yeah.
before I did the book.
I worked a lot with Ruth and Shannon, and they were just
Oh, really?
extraordinary people.
Really?
Yeah,
Oh, you
yeah.
met, wow.
They were.
I
they
really
were
wish I'd met you.
serious
Yes.
artists. No,
Yes, I heard such great stories. I did meet Shalom.
Yes. And just
respect her.
lovely to work with.
Yeah.
As you probably met, Emily. Did you ever come across Ian Sutton? Ian Mackenzie Carr, those people?
Oh, I know the name, but I
Yeah,
didn't
yeah.
meet him.
Yeah,
No,
there's
no.
some huge characters.
Yes,
Yeah.
great characters, yes. As you can imagine, interviewing these people, and I went around Britain interviewing, you know, various retired people as well. They told great stories. They said, "Don't write this down."
Yes. I'm very aware
So I could have written another whole parallel.
I'm aware there's a Zoom going on, so yes, I know
exactly. I'm probably true of any place of work.
Yes,
Actually, yes, it was very interesting. Oh, thank you. Wow.
And that's you said quite a lot at the beginning about the objectives at the time of Red Vienna, and presumably they didn't continue with those particular objectives.
No, because the fascists.
Well, I understood that, but in the later development of Thames and Hudson, they're mostly art, aren't they? They're not.
Well, illustrated, yeah.
Yes.
Illustrated.
Yeah.
But, I mean, archaeology is
Yes.
as important as art. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you saying? Are you asking if Red Vienna carried?
Well,
on?
there was an influence of this sort of social awareness of educating children and.
Well, it was the ethos behind the whole publishing company, yes, of showing the world.
Yes.
And yes, you could say that it's quite
Yeah.
a general thing, but yes, it started off along those lines. And
Yeah.
I'm sure
Interesting.
if Baltimore, I could see the publishing company now. I mean, physically the books look different and so on, but I'm sure you would admire them, and they're still beautifully designed, but you know, respected authors and all of those things. Yes.
Context.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thanks. If anyone's listening online, you can also put your questions
Young man at
in
the back.
chat box. Over to you.
I want to know.
How friendly was the rivalry with Dryden? I'm sort of thinking in terms of Routledge and Faber, where you'd have Herbert Reed, if he thought a book wasn't suitable for him, he'd send it to his friend Eliot at Faber. So it's just sort of wondering if there's anything like that there, or are they sort of
Phaidon and Thames and
frenemies?
Hudson.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a very, very good question. But perhaps people don't know that Phaidon was also founded by Viennese refugees, but founded in Vienna in the 20s, so long before. And they were also Jewish refugees, but they were very, very different. They were not left-wing, they were quite bourgeois. They were different sorts of people. And there was a lot of rivalry between the two, just because they were both Viennese Jewish refugees. They were both businesses and hugely competitive. And especially initially, there was lots of competition and resentment, and you know, they've copied our, you know, the design of this and done this and so on. But actually, they did. Phaidon was very much fine art for a long time, and Thames and Hudson was more, I could say, more modern in terms of things like design, architecture, and so on. So they did both plough their own furrow. But and lots of people went to work. I'm sure you knew people who'd worked at Phaidon as well. There was sort of toing and froing because of them both being these huge illustrated publishers. But yeah, there was rivalry. Yes.
It wasn't friendly rivalry. It was quite vicious.
Well, you have to make generalizations depending on which people we're talking about exactly. But yes, we had a few years ago as part of another organisation I belong to called Insiders Outsiders, looking at the contribution of the refugees to British cultural life. We had a whole exhibition at Sotheby's in the summertime on art publishers, both Thames and Hudson and Phaidon, and gallerists and art dealers, all of whom were refugees. We had a whole massive room and a wonderful time. And we had a panel discussion between, it was Connie Neurath, so the daughter of Walter Neurath, and Ellie Miller, who was the daughter of the founder of Phaidon, been born in Vienna. And so they knew each other and they were quite friendly, but there was this wonderful, very witty, you know, I think you'll find that my father invented Kurdish. I think that's interesting you say that, because actually, you know, we went on like, it was very, and it was wonderful that they managed to show about this rivalry in a quite a friendly, funny fashion.
And in terms of art books, I mean, there's only Lund Humphreys that are really.
Lund Humphreys also had refugees.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That
quite
was a big
important.
three.
Yes, but they were the major ones. Yes, there really wasn't an equivalent British publisher who did anything like that. And because a lot of the book, the techniques had come from, you know, from Europe, just things like, you know, photogravure and the typefaces and lots of printing and things were much more advanced in places like Germany. Britain haven't quite got that to that point.
Thanks. Can I pick up on that point? You mentioned about the integration of text and images side by side.
Yes.
I'm thinking of the sources from the time in magazines doing this all the time, but could you expand on that to explain what the vision was?
Well, Walter Neurath just said you have a different experience if you see the text and the image at the same time. He was convinced that it made a huge difference. And as I said, at the time, a lot of books were, you know, some still are, printed on different sorts of paper at the center of the book. You have to, you know, stop reading and then leaf and find what we're talking about. The German books, I mean, used to be like that too, you know, densely printed, and then there would be another volume. You'd have to look in another book for the illustrations, in some books. That was the old way of doing things. So this was just much more modern. I don't know where he got the idea. And often, if you look in the written in pictures, you know, most of them are not integrated because they couldn't fit it in. They're separate. Yeah, you've got photographs, half, you know, smaller illustrations with some there. But it isn't always possible, of course, to integrate them.
Sorry, if I can say,
Sure.
some of that might be that the emphasis on literature research and the standards of literature research to get something that was so close to the text meant that, because I know the designers had a lot of work trying to get it next to the reference, so they'd be really closely linked with the pictures and text. So it wouldn't just be a sort of random, you know, be really well researched,
Yes.
which came from people like Ava, who had a really
Yes,
interesting,
and Ruth.
and Ruth, yeah,
Yes,
and
yes.
Elizabeth Clark, who was
Yeah,
head of
that's
picture
very
research.
interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't make that
Yeah.
connection.
I think they were sort of cutting it, you know, picture research was a huge,
Yeah.
they had a big department, which I think was very
Yeah.
unusual.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, that's where it came from. That's
Yeah.
amazing, isn't it? I think Ruth brought her little archive with her from Edmund to Thames and Hudson. I heard that she brought it. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got just enough time for any one final point or question before we can
Well, I was just going to say
go
that
ahead.
they still do produce books with little pictures in the middle because it's cheaper. They
Mm.
still do it. You know, it's an economy.
Yeah, my Phaidon book,
Yeah.
ironically, yes,
Yeah,
has
but
got.
it's much better. I myself insisted having pictures next to the text in my book because it makes so much more sense.
Yes, it's the photograph, it's the paper it's printed on.
Yeah.
it's
I
like
used to choose pictures and then write something to fit the gap.
Oh, that's another way of
But
doing it.
it's also much more inclusive because if you're ADHD, for example, if you have a book with writing and then you have to go to the back to look at the picture,
It's
it's like a
distracting.
rabbit hole.
Yes.
Because then I'll just spend the next hour or two going through the images and.
It's a good
how
point,
to
yes.
And
Yes.
I'm no longer with the book anymore, so.
Yes,
So I think these days we know better to do these things. It's really important to have that holistic approach to it.
yeah, I never thought of that, but it's a good.
And it may well be that he was just one of, you know, a lot of neurodivergence clusters quite closely with creativity. There's a very good chance that he might have been one of us, and so realized that this made a better experience for him, and
Yeah.
therefore he extrapolated to others.
Yes, and made it a general practice.
And
Yes,
maybe connected with Red Vienna, and it was for the Kindern.
yes,
Because
yes.
that's how they would learn and how to
Yes, maybe.
communicate
Maybe, yeah.
through books.
Yeah.
Mm.
But I was really amazed because I did, you know, I come from an outsider and I didn't know so much about this, and it just feels so modern and so ahead of its time in every aspect, you know, the look and the graphics and everything. So it sounds like an extraordinary group of people, really.
Yes, yes. Well, they call them Hitler's gift to Britain, you know, because they gave us a huge amount. We were lucky to have them. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think that's reached the end of the session. Let's all thank